She was a woman of beauty, not the kind of beauty that announces itself loudly, but the kind that carries itself with quiet dignity. She was the daughter of a respected man, the wife of a loyal soldier, a woman living an ordinary life in an extraordinary kingdom. No one had written her name in history books. No one was waiting to see what she would become. She was simply living her life day by day, doing what was expected of her, fulfilling her place in the world. Until one moment changed everything. Her name was Bathsheba. In those days, King David ruled over Israel. He was no longer the shepherd boy playing the harp in Saul's palace. He was the king. He was the mighty warrior who had united the kingdom. He was the man after God's own heart, chosen by the Almighty to lead his people. Songs were sung about him. Stories were told of his victories. The entire nation looked to him as their shepherd. But kings, like all men, are capable of falling. Bathsheba lived in Jerusalem with her husband, a man named Uriah. He was a soldier, one of David's most dedicated fighters, part of an elite group known as the Mighty Men of David. Uriah was the kind of man who inspired loyalty and respect. He was committed to his duty. He was faithful. He was honorable. And he was away at war. One evening, as spring turned the season and flowers began to bloom across the land, David found himself unable to sleep. He rose from his bed and walked upon the roof of his palace. It was a place where a king could look out over his city, could breathe the night air, could think about the weight of his rule. And then he saw her. On a rooftop below his palace, a woman was bathing. She was washing herself, likely preparing for a ritual of purification as the law required. It was a private moment, a vulnerable moment, a moment that should have remained unseen. But David saw her, and in that moment the Bible tells us he desired her. It wasn't a passing thought. It wasn't a momentary temptation that he resisted. David wanted her, and as a king, David was accustomed to getting what he wanted. There were no boundaries for him. There was no one to tell him no. He sent servants to find out who she was. They returned with the answer. Her name was Bathsheba. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She was already married. For most men, that would have been the end of it. The knowledge that she belonged to another man, that she was someone's wife, would have been enough to turn away. But David's desire overpowered his righteousness. His power overpowered his conscience. He sent for her. Think about what that moment must have been like for Bathsheba. A servant arrives at your door. The king has summoned you. What choice did you truly have? Could you refuse? Could you say no to the man who ruled over your life, your family, your future? In that ancient world, refusal would have been dangerous. Refusal would have meant risking everything. It would have meant putting her family in jeopardy. It would have meant going against the will of the most powerful person she could possibly encounter. So Bathsheba went to the palace. She did not know that this single walk through the palace gates would change the course of a kingdom and the rest of her life. The Bible doesn't describe in detail, but the outcome was clear. After that night, Bathsheba returned to her home. And then she discovered she was pregnant. She sent a message to the king. I am pregnant. These two words would set in motion a series of events that would shake the kingdom. David's first instinct was to cover up his sin. He sent for Uriah, calling him back from the battlefield under the pretense of wanting news of the war. But David's true intention was different. He wanted Uriah to go home to his wife, so that when the pregnancy became visible, everyone would assume the child was Uriah's. It was a simple plan. It should have worked. Uriah arrived at the palace dusty from travel, exhausted from battle, and David treated him kindly, asked him about the war, and then sent him home with gifts and food. Go home, David told him. Rest with your wife. But Uriah didn't go home. Instead, Uriah slept at the palace gates with the other soldiers. When David learned this, he was troubled. He called Uriah back and asked him why he hadn't gone to his wife. Uriah's response is one of the most noble statements in all of Scripture. He said, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I cannot do such a thing." Uriah was a man of honor. While his king fought for the nation, while his brothers in arms camped in the field, he would not indulge himself in comfort. He would not abandon his duty for personal pleasure. His loyalty made David's betrayal even more profound. David tried again. He invited Uriah to dinner, got him drunk, and sent him home, hoping that in his intoxicated state, Uriah would forget his principles. But even drunk, even pressured, Uriah would not go to his wife. He returned to sleep with the soldiers. David's plan had failed, and now he faced a choice: confess his sin and face the consequences, or do something far darker. He chose darkness. David wrote a letter and gave it to Uriah to deliver to Joab, the commander of the army. The letter contained instructions that seemed to come from the king himself. Uriah, carrying the letter that would seal his own fate, set out once more for the battlefield, having no idea what it truly contained. He delivered it to his commander, Joab, never knowing that his own loyalty had made him expendable. Joab followed the king's orders. In the next battle, he positioned Uriah where the fighting was most intense. Uriah fought bravely, as he always did. And then, in the midst of combat, he was struck down. The man who had fought so faithfully for his king, who had shown such honor and integrity, died on the battlefield. It was murder disguised as war. When word reached David that Uriah was dead, the Bible tells us that David's response was calculated and cold. He sent a message back to Joab. "Don't let this discourage you. The sword devours one as well as another." In other words, forget about it. Move on. This is the way of war. But nothing had been forgotten by God. Bathsheba, meanwhile, mourned her husband. She didn't know what had happened. All she knew was that her husband, the man she had trusted, was dead, and she was pregnant with the king's child. After her period of mourning ended, David took her as his wife. He married the woman whose husband he had killed, and the child she was carrying would now be born into the palace, born as the king's child, born into a life of privilege and power. But the child conceived in betrayal would not be born into blessing. The Bible tells us clearly, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." When Bathsheba's son was born, he was beautiful. The palace celebrated the arrival of a royal child, but the child was sick. Despite all of David's power, despite all the resources of the kingdom, the child grew weaker. David fell to his knees in prayer. He fasted. He spent nights lying on the ground, begging God for his son's life. The king of Israel, the mighty warrior, the man after God's own heart, was brought low by his own sin and the suffering of an innocent child. For 7 days, David prayed. For 7 days, he refused to eat. For 7 days, he lay in sackcloth, begging for mercy. Bathsheba sat beside the cradle, watching over her son with quiet, desperate hope. The servants of the palace watched anxiously, afraid of what was to come, but unwilling to speak of it aloud. Each day brought new fear, and each night brought little rest, for the child's strength continued to fade. David continued to pray, refusing all comfort, refusing all food, his heart breaking with every passing hour. But on the 7th day, everything was about to change. On the 7th day, the child died. The servants of the palace were terrified to tell the king. They whispered among themselves, "How can we tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate." But David overheard them whispering, and he asked simply, "Is the child dead?" They answered, "Yes." David rose from the ground. He washed himself, he changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And then he went to Bathsheba. The Bible describes what happened next with a tenderness that might seem surprising. David comforted his wife. Time passed, and in time she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. This child would be different. This child would live. But first, David had to face the consequences of his actions. The prophet Nathan came to him. Nathan told David a parable. He spoke of a rich man with many flocks and a poor man with only one lamb. The rich man took the poor man's lamb to feed a guest. When David heard the story, he was outraged. "That man deserves to die," he declared. And Nathan looked at him and said, "You are the man." The prophet laid bare David's sin. He showed the king that he had murdered Uriah, that he had taken another man's wife. And David, in that moment, finally broke. He confessed. He said simply, "I have sinned against the Lord." There was no excuse. There was no justification. Just the raw admission of his guilt. Nathan told him the consequences. "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because of what you have done, the son born to you will die." David accepted the judgment with quiet sorrow, understanding at last the full weight of what his choices had cost. Through it all, Bathsheba carried her own burden. The widow of Uriah, the mother of a child who had died, blamed in whispered conversations, though she had been powerless to refuse the king. In that culture, women who bore such circumstances were marked and shamed. But Bathsheba endured. She survived. She carried her loss and her shame, and she moved forward. And then came Solomon, the son born from sin and redeemed by grace. The God who saw Bathsheba truly saw her in her pain and her loss and her shame, was still at work, weaving redemption from the ashes of betrayal. Her story was not over. It was only just beginning to be redeemed. From betrayal and loss, God was already preparing to raise up the wisest king Israel would ever know.